We're interviewing Matin Qaim. He's professor for food economics at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Professor Qaim, what are genetically modified crops?
Well, genetically modified crops are crops that have been genetically engineered to introduce desirable traits such as resistance to pests or diseases or tolerance to drought or heat. And agriculture always has tried and breeding has tried to develop crops that have desirable traits to produce more food and to reduce the resource requirements to produce food. And with genetic engineering, there have been, or there are tools that can make this breeding process more effective.
At this Gottfried von Haberler conference, you're talking about genetically modified crops and food security. What is the relationship?
Yeah, agriculture and plant production is obviously very important for food production. So when we look at the role of agricultural production and agricultural technologies to produce more food, then historically, obviously, it was the introduction of new types of technologies that has helped globally to reduce hunger and to make food more available and accessible to poor people. Now we're at a stage where hunger isn't overcome and the population is still further growing, and therefore the question of how can we produce more food with limited resources on our planet is one that's relevant. But there is an additional aspect that's interesting because hunger is not only about enough food, it's also the question, can poor people access this food? Do they have enough money? Do they have enough income? And something that many people don't know is that most of the poor and hungry people in the world are actually farmers, are small-scale farmers, and therefore agricultural technologies can also play the role of increasing their incomes, and that makes food more accessible and reduces poverty in the small farm sector.
But very often the media portrays genetically modified crops and agriculture technology as something that exclusively benefits the large companies and the rich countries.
Well, that's true. It's not true, the statement, but it's true that the larger public believes that, and to some extent this is related to the fact that genetically modified crops have been largely developed by a few multinational companies, such as Monsanto and Syngenta and a few others. And there's the belief that big business and small farmers does not fit together well. There are fears of exploitation of small farmers through these large companies. And the reality, I think, shows us that, first of all, some of the technologies that these companies do develop can be beneficial for farmers against expectations and do not lead to exploitation. The other element, and that's also important, however, is that we should not rely only on large companies developing biotechnology. And unfortunately, we are in this situation because the regulatory hurdles have been pushed so high that makes regulation so costly that only the large companies can afford to bring genetically modified crops to market. And that's a bad development. It's not the technology as such that is expensive, it's really the regulation that makes it expensive and that drives market concentration, that drives monopolies, which in the end are undesirable. There's nothing against large companies, but as soon as we're getting into monopoly situations, it's not good for society and for innovation.
Actually, it's the regulation that prevents small and medium enterprises or these small farm holders to come up with biotechnology, with genetically modified crops and agricultural technology of their own.
Yes, I mean it's definitely regulation and inefficient regulation that drives up costs and makes it much less likely that technologies for small farmers and poor people in Africa are being developed. So there are a few examples. Even Monsanto developed technologies that do benefit small-scale farmers, but we would love to see much more of these examples. And regulation is the critical bottleneck that prevents this from happening.
You have field research experience. If I'm right, if I understood it correctly, you did field research in India.
Mm-hmm.
How do small farmers in India use the genetically modified crops and agricultural technology?
In India, it's one particular type of crop, namely genetically modified cotton, that has inbuilt resistance to insect pests that has been commercially released more than 15 years ago. And in India, cotton is produced by small-scale farmers. Most of them have less than 2 or 3 hectares. Here's an example where millions of small-scale farmers have rapidly adopted these genetically modified seeds and are benefiting in terms of lower insecticide sprays to control the insect pests and higher yields because they're suffering less from crop damage, and higher incomes. And within a few years, more than 95% of the cotton farmers all over India have adopted this technology and are largely benefiting from this. And this is really one of those examples where small-scale farmers do benefit, and it does lead to poverty reduction in the Indian farm sector.
And what's the situation in Africa?
In Africa, there are a few examples where farmers are already allowed to use GM crops. South Africa is one example, there Sudan has also a little bit. But the situation is African countries are primarily looking at what Europe is doing. And if the Europeans say, well, we don't like these technologies and there are public acceptance problems, then Africans say, well, there must be something wrong with these technologies. We don't want to be the guinea pigs of testing this. And that's something that's really tragic because we in Europe, based on perceptions and false perceptions and prejudices, we are actually banning a technology that we may not need, but Africans would need it. But with our attitudes towards these technologies that are overly critical and prejudiced, we're influencing policymakers and the wider public in Africa as well of thinking, well, there must be something wrong with this technology, which isn't true.
Professor Qaim, what does the future bring?
Well, I mean, plant breeding technologies are crucial for sustainable development. There are only 2 types of organisms on our planet that can convert sunlight into biomass, and that's algae and that's plants. And if we are serious about sustainable development and using renewable resources and making food security a reality against planetary boundaries, then I think we need to see that plant genetic engineering is one of the key technologies that can help us to realize those objectives. And I think as a world community, we cannot afford to not use these technologies, and we have to find ways of more science-based communication. We have to find ways of more efficient regulation. Not saying that we don't need any regulation. I mean, regulation is good in order to make sure that technologies can be used responsibly. But we need to really seriously reform regulation, and we need to seriously reform the way the public debate about plant technologies goes. I haven't lost my optimism, but it's not easy, and we have been trying for many years. But let's keep on trying.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Mein Thema ist gar nicht primär Biotech. Ich komme aus dem Hintergrund Welternährungsfragen. Ich bin Agrarökonom. Nun beschäftige ich mich mit der Frage Biotech seit über 25 Jahren.